Privacy has never been more under threat, but strangely at the same time, it's also never been more alive. We're faced with unprecedented threats from not just companies, but also governments who can learn more about us than was ever previously possible. But I'm quite hopeful because at the same time, we're seeing an exceptionally lively debate about privacy happening around the world, not just in Europe. What's so fascinating about this debate is that the definition of privacy is shifting. In the past, privacy was often misconstrued as being about hiding or secrecy, whereas the debates we're seeing right now understand privacy as what it really is, which is about power dynamics. It's about the relationship between individuals, the market, and the state. And that's why we're actually a little bit hopeful. My job at Privacy International, the program I'm managing is called data exploitation. We think that we're living in a world where it's impossible to know what kinds of data companies and governments hold on you. And that creates a vast power asymmetry between those that can learn things about you and profit from it and those who are affected by it. The idea that we are giving up data in return for services is dangerously misguided. First of all, the data that you actively provide is just a tiny fraction of the data that companies actually use to make money. Take the example of your smartphone. It goes without saying that a smartphone app needs data in order to function, but does it need thousands of third-party trackers that record your location and then build a fine-grained profile of your whereabouts? I think that's not part of the deal. So I think, first of all, it is important to recognize that the data that we provide are just a tiny fraction of the data that companies use to make profit. At the same time, I don't like the idea that giving up your fundamental right is a necessary precondition in order to participate in society. For many people around the world, companies like Facebook are the internet. It is not really possible to opt out. So we think companies have a responsibility to provide services that protect people by default. And it is not your job to become a full-time data protection expert to understand what is happening to your data. It is currently impossible to fully understand how companies collect data about you, and that's a real problem. There's a tendency in cybersecurity discourses to focus exclusively on criminals, on terrorism. We have a very different conception of what cybersecurity means. Cybersecurity means protecting people, devices, and networks, and that's a much more comprehensive view. We don't think that the threat of criminality should be a pretext for mass surveillance. Because ultimately, mass surveillance is a security risk itself because it makes people more vulnerable. So there's a persistent misconception that privacy is a European idea, and nothing could be further from the truth. Privacy, first of all, is a human right. And secondly, also data protection is a widely recognized way in order to protect the right to privacy. About 126 countries around the world have some form of data protection regulation. These regimes look very, very different in practice, but they all have the same purpose, which is to protect people's privacies. Now, in practice, obviously, there are different philosophies of how privacy can best be protected. And the United States, for instance, has privacy laws, but they regulate sectors and not data in general. What we're seeing, I think, or we think at Privacy International, is that emerging technologies undermining regimes that regulate privacy purely by sectors. And I can give you an example. You can have the best healthcare data laws in the world that protect, for example, the confidentiality between patients and doctors. But we live in a world where very sensitive medical information can be derived and inferred from things like your purchasing histories, your browsing histories, which means that your medical information is up for grabs. It's also important to recognize that an under-regulated data ecosystem is not just a threat to democracy, but also poses security risks. If your data ecosystem is under-regulated, people's most sensitive information is up for grabs. There was a study done by Amnesty International, which I thought was fascinating, in the context of Donald Trump claiming or toying with the idea of building a Muslim database. Amnesty tried to find out how easy is it actually to buy a list of everybody who's a Muslim in the United States. And the reality is, for like about $150,000, $60,000, you can buy a list of email addresses, phone numbers, and addresses of everybody who's Muslim in the United States. That's simply unacceptable, I think. So even though there are differences in philosophies, all legal regimes have to grapple with the fact that we are faced with unprecedented threats that need to be addressed. When it comes to the Internet of Things and all new technologies, I'd love to talk a little bit about what technology how we think about technology in general. We think about technology as inevitable, that there are inevitable processes or almost natural forces happening that then we as society have to grapple with. The more important or the more pressing question is, what kind of world do we want to live in? And we are moving towards a world in which your fridge has a microphone, your toy has a camera, all of this is insecure, hackable, and highly privacy invasive, and that's not the kind of world I want to live in. In the way that it is developing at the moment, and this is not inevitably the case, we could build an Internet of Things that is more privacy, security, and safety respecting than what we're seeing. But the Internet of Things that is beginning to develop poses unprecedented threats. Most people still think about privacy as online privacy, so the privacy they have when they open a website. But we hear companies saying that with the Internet of Things, the next place to mine data is the home. When you have conversations with smart devices, you reveal extremely intimate and sensitive details, and this is very profitable. We used to say, whenever you're not paying for the service, you are the product. With the IoT, we're seeing you're paying for sometimes very expensive devices, and you're still the product. So in all scenarios where the business model is mining your data without being very transparent and open about it, this is hugely problematic. GDPR is an interesting example because people's inboxes have been flooded with new privacy policies, and the reason why companies are updating their privacy policies is not because they feel like it, but because they have been forced to do so. There's obviously an industry interest in in having happy customers and in having safe and secure products, but the pattern we have been observing over the past years is that it does take regulation more often than not in order to give the right incentives. In a world of data exploitation, incentives are misaligned. Privacy is a human right, and as such, governments and also companies have an obligation to protect privacy. What I'm most concerned about is that we're dealing with a new breed of companies that we haven't really figured out how to define. Let me give you an example. A company like Facebook is not just a neutral platform. In many countries around the world where Facebook is the internet, the company provides an infrastructure, and that raises questions of how we can not just hope that such a company respects human rights, but also how we can hold them to account. I mean, government's also very complicit in human rights violations. That's why I wouldn't put all my faith in regulation. At the same time, I do think regulation is important, an important control and oversight mechanism. More fundamentally, though, I think if the service you're providing is almost infrastructure and so crucial to things like democracy and discourse, we need to think about how this can be more democratized, or how this can become much more transparent than it currently is. We're very excited about GDPR because an overhaul was long overdue. In the UK, for example, the Data Protection Act is from 1998. So before, I think that's the year that Google was founded, and long before companies like Facebook existed. So GDPR is a very positive and exciting step in the right direction. We're now seeing one-page ads from companies in newspapers not just embracing, but also celebrating GDPR. And sometimes those were the very companies who were heavily involved in lobbying against GDPR. So GDPR proves that regulation works in that it pressures or it sets the right incentives for companies to comply with privacy standards. It's very dangerous to assume that technology is so complicated that it can't be regulated. And if you watch the hearings in the US Senate, that was the takeaway that many journalists or also even civil society organizations in the US took away. That's dangerous because what we're dealing with might be new and complex, but it's not rocket science. As society, we regulate all sorts of complex things, and it is important that we do not place the onus on people to protect themselves, but that people are protected by default. One example would be food safety. I'm not a chemist. I'm not an expert in analyzing the chemistry of the food I'm eating. I have to rely on institutions and rules to make sure that I'm not being poisoned. And the same is true for the protection of fundamental rights, not just online, but in all technology. GDPR is a short form for General Data Protection Regulation. It's an overhaul of existing data protection laws in Europe. The philosophy behind data protection is you don't own your data, but you have something much more powerful, which is you have rights over your data no matter who holds it. GDPR changes existing laws in three crucial and important ways. One is it gives people more rights. There are important rights such as the right to portability, so your right to take data from one provider to the next. That's quite powerful. It also places more stringent obligations on companies. The accountability principle shifts the onus from people to companies or those that process data to demonstrate that they're compliant. GDPR doesn't prevent you from processing data, but it sets the ground rules that anyone who deals with personal data has to respect. GDPR doesn't revolutionize, it simply updates existing data protection laws. The problem under existing laws were, on the one hand, that it was sometimes very difficult to prove that a company was non-compliant. And what GDPR changes is that it comes with hefty fines. It has an extraterritorial scope, which means that it applies not just to companies that are based in the European Union, but also to companies that are based anywhere in the world, but that monitor the behavior of EU citizens or offer goods and services to people in the EU. So it closes some existing loopholes. A lot of the tracking companies, for example, third-party trackers and websites and apps, are based outside the European Union, and suddenly they have to comply. The Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal has been a wake-up call for companies and governments around the world. It was always very difficult for us to communicate the actual harm, because a lot of time when your privacy is being invaded, you actually don't notice or you don't really feel the consequences. We've said for a long time that the entire purpose of the fact that you're being surveilled and tracked 24 hours a day is to modify and change behavior. That's the purpose of targeted advertisement. And it doesn't come as a surprise that political actors are also interested in this kind of ecosystem. There are many bad actors out there, and I don't think a single company deserves all the attention. We think there is a systemic problem behind the way that people are being tracked, monitored, and profiled, and that's not limited to a single company. And this is what needs to change now. Because Facebook, Cambridge Analytica is now no longer in business, but that doesn't mean the problem is solved. It always seems like it's just ads, and ads are harmless. But the targeted advertisement system comes with an entire ecosystem made up of thousands of companies in the background. And Cambridge Analytica is just one of them that happens to work on politics. But there are many other actors that are interested in tapping into these data troves. Scammers, law enforcement, intelligence agencies. And that's why we think an under-regulated, opaque data ecosystem is a real problem. There are good companies and bad practices. A good company is very transparent with you about what they're doing with your data. Unfortunately, bad practices are very widespread and common, and that's our concern. It depends a little bit on the business model. There are business models which are inherently problematic because they're premised on the idea that you can harvest people's data without their knowledge or consent. And there are business models where there's definitely there's no inherent contradiction, and it might actually be in the interest of a company to offer privacy respecting services. I'm worried about three closely intertwined trends. So we are living in a world of data exploitation, which means thousands of companies, entities have unprecedented insights into your life, and this data may or may not be correct in the first place. The second development is that this data is increasingly being fed into automated and complex systems that not just identify you or judge you, but also make or inform decisions that are of great consequence. And the third trend, which is not a tech trend, but more an ideology that having a bit of a revision these days, is the belief that people's life is determined, that you have an essence, and that I can see from your face who you are, basically. If you put the three together, the things that I find terrifying are developments like the use or misuse of AI to determine whether you're a criminal. That's a worrying pseudoscientific trend that we have to be very careful about and take a strong stance to make sure that this is not becoming mainstream. What keeps me up at night are two closely intertwined developments. And one is the tendency that people are being identified, judged, and profiled based on opaque and automated systems. One example would be if you pair CCTV cameras with facial recognition in order to make decisions, identify people in public spaces, but also to make judgments about them, such as who looks angry, who looks like a threat, who could be homeless, who could be an alcoholic. So this is one development, but this is increasingly being paired with not a technological development, but with an ideology that assumes that people's identities and characters are fixed and determined. And if you put the two together, you have pseudoscientific trends such as technology that tries to predict criminality from faces, or technologies that judge your character based on your face as well. And this combined is extremely worrying. Civil society and nonprofits are important because their purpose is to represent the public interest. The questions we're dealing with involve some of the richest and wealthiest companies in the world who might have good intentions, but who always have a profit interest in certain practices that might actually not be to the benefit of all of us. So that's why the involvement of civil society NGOs is really crucial. So just having someone in the room who's not paid to say what they're saying really can make all the difference. But there's a second dimension in which civil society and NGOs are needed. Data exploitation means there's a fundamental asymmetry between those that mine and profit from data and those about whom this data is. We need people to investigate opaque systems, and we need people to uncover what is actually happening in the first place. Perhaps the most important takeaway from the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal is that even blatant violations of the law often require investigations to reach the light of day. And there are thousands of more scandals and worrying practices that need to be talked about, that need to be investigated, that need to be uncovered.